The year is 1963. America is in turmoil. The fight for civil rights is reaching a fever pitch, with marches, protests, and legislative battles unfolding across the nation. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. stands as a beacon of hope, advocating for nonviolent resistance and racial equality. His "I Have a Dream" speech at the March on Washington later that year would become an iconic moment, cementing his legacy and inspiring millions. But before that moment, in April 1963, King found himself in Birmingham, Alabama, facing fierce opposition, arrest, and public criticism, even from some white clergy. It was from a jail cell there that he penned his powerful Letter from Birmingham Jail, a crucial defense of civil disobedience. But what if at this critical juncture, Dr. King's message of nonviolence had been decisively rejected by a significant portion of the movement? What if instead, the call for immediate armed self-defense had taken precedence? Our point of divergence takes us to the spring of 1963. Imagine this: the brutal images from Birmingham, police dogs, fire hoses, children being arrested, spark not just outrage, but a widespread, decisive shift in strategy. Many within the movement, disillusioned by the slow pace of change and the constant violence inflicted upon non-violent protesters, lose faith in King's philosophy. Charismatic, more radical leaders, perhaps from a newly formed, fiercely independent group like the Black Shields, advocating for black nationalism and armed resistance, would gain ascendancy. They wouldn't merely suggest, they'd preach that self-defense was not just a right, but an immediate necessity, and that only force could truly dismantle systemic oppression. Their message, broadcast through underground networks and hushed community meetings, would resonate with those who had witnessed too much suffering. This strategic pivot would unleash a dramatic and immediate escalation of violence, transforming peaceful demonstrations into organized armed confrontations that would send shockwaves across the nation. Instead of nonviolent marches met with police brutality, black communities, particularly in the Deep South, would rapidly form well-regulated self-defense groups. These weren't spontaneous mobs. They were often disciplined, armed with rifles, shotguns, and Molotov cocktails, preparing to meet aggression with force. The shift would be palpable. The quiet dignity of a sit-in replaced by the tense silence before a potential firefight. The nightly news would cease to be solely about peaceful demonstrators being attacked. It would now be dominated by harrowing footage of armed standoffs, intense shootouts, and brutal retaliatory actions. Neighborhoods once scenes of stoic protest would become flashpoints of urban warfare, with makeshift barricades erected on street corners, shattered windows testifying to recent skirmishes, and the constant smell of smoke in the air. The strategic objective for these groups wouldn't just be self-preservation. It would also be to directly challenge the instruments of segregation. We might see armed groups attempting to force entry into segregated establishments, leading to deadly confrontations with local police and white supremacist paramilitaries, like the Ku Klux Klan or newly formed citizens' councils that would now operate more openly as militias. The era of peaceful suffering would be over, replaced by an unsettling, visceral fight for survival and liberation. The psychological toll on both sides would be immense, hardening hearts and entrenching positions further. The cycle of violence would be difficult, if not impossible, to break, leading to a grim, perpetual state of low-intensity conflict across the South and spilling into urban centers nationwide. Consider the stark numbers. In our own timeline, the civil rights movement, despite its nonviolent approach, saw over 40 deaths directly linked to the struggle between 1954 and 1968, with countless more injured. In this alternate reality, these numbers would skyrocket. We might see hundreds, if not thousands, of fatalities in the initial years, with urban centers like Birmingham, Montgomery, and Jackson experiencing a body count more akin to a low-grade civil war. For instance, a single armed confrontation attempting to desegregate a city hall could result in dozens of casualties on both sides rather than just arrests. The Southern Poverty Law Center, SPLC, documented over 5,000 hate crimes in the United States between 1990 and 2012. In this timeline, the sheer volume and intensity of racially motivated violence in the 1960s would dwarf those figures, likely reaching into the tens of thousands of incidents annually. The racial demographics of victims and perpetrators would reflect the conflict. While white supremacist groups might initially inflict more casualties, the armed black self-defense groups would also inflict significant losses, transforming the narrative from one of oppression to one of mutually assured destruction. The adoption of armed self-defense wouldn't be a unanimous decision within the civil rights movement. Deep schisms would form, pitting the established leadership still adhering to King's philosophy against the more radical, newly empowered factions. Figures like Dr. King, Bayard Rustin, and John Lewis would find their voices increasingly marginalized, their calls for nonviolence dismissed as naive or ineffective in the face of escalating brutality. The moral authority that had been their greatest weapon would dissipate, replaced by the stark reality of armed conflict. Conferences that once debated strategies for peaceful protest would descend into heated arguments over arms procurement and tactical defense. Grassroots activists, witnessing their communities under siege, would gravitate towards leaders who promised immediate, tangible protection. The Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SCLC, and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNACC, would see their ranks dwindle or their focus fundamentally altered, with younger, more impatient members defecting to armed groups. This internal fragmentation would weaken the movement's unified front, making it harder to coordinate efforts and articulate a coherent demand for justice beyond the immediate need for survival. The powerful imagery of disciplined nonviolence, which had galvanized national and international sympathy, would be tragically lost, replaced by images of armed confrontation that would alienate potential allies. Some disillusioned members might withdraw from activism altogether, succumbing to despair, while others might join the more radical fringes, believing that only through total revolution could true equality be achieved. In our history, organizations like the SCLC and SNACC boasted tens of thousands of active members and supporters. In this alternate reality, these numbers would likely dwindle significantly for the nonviolent factions. For example, SNACC, which had a peak of over 200 full-time field staff and thousands of student volunteers in the mid-1960s, might see its core membership shrink by 50% or more as activists shift towards armed groups. The Black Shields, or similar groups, could rapidly swell their ranks, potentially attracting hundreds of thousands of adherents across the nation, especially in urban centers in the South where racial tensions were highest. The shift in resources would be equally dramatic. Instead of fundraising for voter registration drives and legal defense, money would be diverted to purchasing firearms, ammunition, and other combat supplies. The financial base of nonviolent organizations, often supported by sympathetic white philanthropists and church groups, would likely collapse, further empowering the more radical, self-funded, or even illicitly funded armed factions. This profound change would not only fracture the social fabric, but also cripple the political landscape, pushing the nation to the very brink of internal collapse. President Kennedy's administration, already grappling with the complexities of civil rights and the Cuban Missile Crisis's lingering tension, would find itself facing an unprecedented domestic crisis. The moral clarity of the nonviolent movement, which had artfully garnered crucial national and international sympathy, would be utterly extinguished. Instead, the perception would shift to one of widespread fear, chaos, and condemnation. The international community, once sympathetic to the plight of Black Americans, might now view the U.S. as a nation descending into internal strife, its democratic ideals under severe strain. Diplomatic relations with newly independent African nations would sour as images of armed conflict between Black citizens and the state painted a grim picture. The Soviet Union and its allies would seize the opportunity to highlight American hypocrisy on human rights, gaining significant propaganda victories on the world stage, undermining U.S. efforts to champion democracy globally. The Civil Rights Act of 1964, a landmark piece of legislation in our timeline that dismantled legal segregation, would be in grave peril. Public support for the movement would plummet amidst the escalating violence, making it politically untenable for many legislators, even those with moderate leanings, to vote in favor. The bill might be substantially watered down, stripped of its most potent enforcement provisions, or even fail to pass altogether, leaving the scaffolding of Jim Crow laws firmly in place for decades longer. The political capital needed to push such transformative legislation would be squandered on managing domestic insurrections. A swift and intense backlash from white moderates and conservatives, fueled by fear and a perceived threat to law and order, would lead to even greater political polarization. This would solidify an entrenched, often militarized opposition to racial equality and usher in an era of heightened political gridlock, where any attempt at progressive social legislation would be met with fierce, often armed, resistance. The very notion of bipartisan cooperation on civil rights would become a distant, almost forgotten memory, replaced by a deep partisan divide that would persist for decades, irrevocably altering the trajectory of American governance. In our history, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 passed with overwhelming bipartisan support, 73 votes to 27 in the Senate and 289 to 126 in the House of Representatives. In this alternate timeline, it's highly probable the vote would be significantly closer or even fail. Public opinion data from the time shows fluctuating support for civil rights. A Gallup poll from May 1963 indicated that 50% of Americans believed the Kennedy administration was pushing integration too fast. With widespread armed conflict, this number would undoubtedly increase, potentially reaching 70 to 80% opposition to significant civil rights legislation. The political backlash would be severe. The Republican Party, instead of being split, would likely coalesce around a law and order platform, gaining significant electoral advantages. Similarly, many Southern Democrats, already staunch segregationists, would find their positions strengthened. This could lead to a far more conservative Supreme Court and a series of legislative setbacks that would delay meaningful racial equality by decades. The number of Black Americans registered to vote in the South, which increased from 29.3% in 1960 to 62.7% in 1970 in our timeline, would likely remain stagnant or even decrease due to widespread voter suppression and violence. The daily reality for most Americans, regardless of race, would be one of heightened tension and constant vigilance. In major urban centers and the volatile southern states, the presence of armed groups, both Black self-defense units and white vigilantes, would be palpable. Curfews would become common, roadblocks would be erected, and the lines between civilian life and open conflict would blur. Children would grow up accustomed to the sight of armed patrols, the sound of distant gunfire, and the knowledge that a wrong turn could lead to a deadly confrontation. Schools in affected areas would be sporadically closed, education disrupted, and the innocent pursuit of childhood replaced by the grim realities of survival. Families would be divided not only by race, but by ideology. White families might find themselves living in fortified suburban enclaves, fearful of urban unrest, while Black families would be forced to navigate their communities as potential battlegrounds, balancing the need for security with the desire for a semblance of normal life. The media, rather than being a unifying force, would likely become a tool for propaganda, with different news outlets catering to and reinforcing existing racial and political biases, further deepening the societal rifts. Rumors and misinformation would spread like wildfire, fueling paranoia and distrust. The simple act of going to the grocery store or attending a church service could become fraught with danger, leading to a pervasive sense of insecurity and a profound loss of innocence for the entire nation. The economic impact would be equally severe. Businesses would flee urban centers, leading to massive job losses and a decline in property values. The migration of both Black and white Americans would increase dramatically. But instead of the Great Migration driven by economic opportunity, it would be a forced migration driven by violence and fear, creating internal refugee crises. The psychological toll on the population would manifest in soaring rates of post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, anxiety, and depression. Healthcare systems, already strained, would be overwhelmed by physical injuries and mental health crises. The trust between different racial groups, which was slowly being built in our timeline, would be shattered, leading to generations of animosity and division. Social surveys today show that racial trust in the U.S. remains a challenge, with only 50% of white Americans and 25% of black Americans saying they trust people of other races a lot or a fair amount. In this alternate reality, these numbers would be significantly lower, potentially single-digit percentages, representing a truly fractured society. The economic impact of such widespread unrest and violence would be devastating and long-lasting, crippling the nation's prosperity and its global standing. It would deter investment, both domestic and foreign, as businesses shied away from the pervasive instability and uncertainty. Capital flight would become a significant problem, as investors sought safer havens abroad, starving American enterprises of crucial funds for expansion and innovation. Commerce would be severely disrupted, with supply chains fractured, transportation routes compromised by conflict, and consumer confidence plummeting, leading to widespread business failures. The resulting economic instability would hit marginalized communities the hardest, as jobs vanished, property values plummeted, and opportunities for advancement dwindled to almost nothing. Access to education, healthcare, and other essential services would also be severely curtailed, exacerbating existing inequalities and creating new ones, trapping generations in cycles of poverty and limited opportunity. Cities would suffer immense physical damage from sustained conflicts, requiring colossal sums for rebuilding that would likely never fully materialize amidst the perpetual chaos and lack of central governance in affected areas. Infrastructure would crumble, and urban centers would become symbols of national decline rather than progress, resembling war zones in some instances. The dream of shared prosperity, a cornerstone of King's vision for a just America, would be pushed further out of reach for marginalized communities, condemning generations to cycles of poverty, unemployment, and deprivation. The nation standing on the global stage would also suffer dramatically. Its image as a beacon of democracy and opportunity would be tarnished, impacting trade relations, diplomatic influence, and its ability to project soft power. International aid might even be offered to the U.S. as it struggled to contain its internal strife, a humiliating reversal of roles. The economic downturn would also fuel further social unrest, creating a vicious cycle of violence, repression, and deepening decline. Consider the economic cost of internal conflict. For comparison, the estimated cost of the Northern Ireland Troubles, 1968 to 1998, a period of lower intensity conflict, is estimated to be in the tens of billions of pounds sterling. A widespread armed conflict in the United States, with a far larger population and economy, could easily lead to trillions of dollars in economic losses over decades. The U.S. GDP, which grew at an average rate of 4.4% annually in the 1960s in our timeline, would likely stagnate or even contract for prolonged periods. Unemployment rates, which hovered around 5% during that era, could easily reach double-digit figures, particularly in conflict-ridden areas. Poverty rates, which saw a significant decline from 22.4% in 1959 to 11.1% in 1973, due in part to the Great Society programs, would likely remain stubbornly high or even increase. The national debt would balloon due to increased military spending and a contracting tax base. The very foundation of the American middle class, particularly for Black Americans who were just beginning to gain economic traction, would be severely eroded, setting back racial economic equality by generations. In this alternate history, the yearning for justice is met not with peaceful transformation, but with armed struggle, a bitter clash that leaves no true victors, only deeper wounds. The movement for civil rights, instead of uniting the nation towards a common ideal of equality and brotherhood, plunges it into a prolonged period of intense internal conflict, a war fought on the streets and in the hearts of its citizens. The very notion of a United States would be a cruel irony, as the nation became increasingly segmented by fear and violence. The legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., the unwavering advocate for peace, would be a tragic echo, a faint whisper of what might have been, completely swallowed by the deafening roar of gunfire and the desperate, bitter cries of a nation tearing itself to shreds. His words of hope, reconciliation, and the moral imperative of nonviolence would be tragically drowned out by the escalating violence, leaving a far more somber, fractured, and divisive chapter in American history. The dream would remain just that, an unattainable vision lost in the nightmare of perpetual conflict. This stark alternative forces us to reflect on the immense strategic wisdom and moral fortitude of the nonviolent path chosen by Dr. King and the profound sacrifices made by countless individuals to achieve a more just society against incredible odds. The path not taken here serves as a potent reminder of the fragility of peace and the immense cost of societal division. It underscores how the choices made at pivotal moments can forever alter the destiny of a nation, shaping its identity and its future. The historical narratives of civil rights in this alternate timeline would be written in blood. Instead of celebrating landmark legislative victories and the triumph of moral persuasion, textbooks would recount a brutal, protracted conflict. The images associated with the movement would shift from peaceful marches and iconic speeches to armed standoffs, urban skirmishes, and mass casualties. The collective memory of the nation would be scarred by internal strife, fostering deep-seated resentments and a pervasive sense of insecurity. The very identity of America, built on ideals of liberty and justice, would be fundamentally challenged, replaced by a narrative of internal discord and unresolved racial tension. The hope for a beloved community, a central tenet of King's philosophy, would be a distant, almost forgotten ideal, replaced by a society perpetually on edge, its unity a fragile illusion. The price of this alternate history would be paid not just in economic terms or physical damage, but in the profound and lasting psychological scars on generations of Americans, leaving a legacy of fear, mistrust, and an unfulfilled promise of equality. Beyond its internal struggles, a fractured and violent America would suffer a precipitous decline in its global standing and influence. The Cold War, already a tense ideological struggle, would intensify dramatically. The Soviet Union would seize every opportunity to exploit American internal strife, presenting the U.S. as a hypocritical nation unable to even secure basic human rights for its own citizens. Propaganda campaigns would highlight images of urban warfare and racial oppression, undermining American claims of moral superiority and democratic ideals. This narrative would resonate deeply in newly independent nations across Africa and Asia, many of whom had just emerged from colonial rule and were observing the American experiment with a critical eye. Instead of aligning with the U.S., these nations might lean towards the Soviet bloc or pursue a more pronounced non-aligned stance, diminishing American soft power and diplomatic leverage on the world stage. Trade relations would also suffer. International partners wary of instability and the economic downturn would divert investments and seek more reliable markets. The U.S. dollar, though still strong, would face increased pressure from global investors, potentially leading to inflationary spirals and further economic woes. The ability of the U.S. to project its military might and influence abroad would be severely hampered, as resources and attention would be diverted to maintaining domestic order. Military spending would shift from global defense to internal security, leading to the rapid expansion of federal and state police forces, often equipped with military-grade hardware. The very notion of America as a global leader, a beacon of democracy and a force for good, would be severely eroded, replaced by an image of internal decay and failure. This decline would not be a fleeting moment, but a long-term shift as other global powers rose to fill the vacuum left by a preoccupied and weakened United States. The "I have a dream" speech in this alternate reality would be a footnote, a beautiful but ultimately futile plea for peace in a world engulfed by fire. Dr. King's moral authority, so powerful in our timeline, would be drowned out by the cries for vengeance and immediate, tangible protection. The March on Washington, instead of a unified demonstration for jobs and freedom, might still occur, but it would be overshadowed by the preceding weeks and months of violence, or even devolve into armed clashes itself. The iconic images of unity and hope would be replaced by scenes of armed confrontation and fear. The legacy of the civil rights movement would be tragically transformed. Instead of paving the way for legislative triumphs like the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, it would become a cautionary tale of a nation consumed by internal conflict. The gains made in our timeline, such as the gradual desegregation of schools and public spaces, would be stalled, if not reversed, as fear and division cemented racial lines. Generations would grow up with a deep-seated distrust of institutions and each other, perpetuating cycles of violence and inequality. The fight for true racial justice would become an enduring, perhaps even insurmountable struggle, leaving a scar on the American psyche that would take centuries to heal, if ever.